and we can start the YouTube transmission.
Transmission. Yes, we're all set. Live transmission starting now.
Good. If you have the TV, that's fine. Otherwise, you can get started here too.
You can get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing fine. A lot of things for us to discuss today. And before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to say that I was pleased with your assignments. So overall, you did a good job. There's, of course, a lot of room for improvement, but important first for this first OPM piece, you guys reached this expectation. We're going to be talking about this on the second part when we stop the camera. Okay, and we are getting started. So, welcome to Brazil Seminar. My name is Sidney Nakahodo. I'm a lecturer at Transparency at Columbia University, and this is a very special session today where we are talking about ESG. The term ESG has become part of the corporate governance in recent years. However, the importance of environmental, social, and governance factors transcends the word. While environment and social are intuitive, governance might be more abstract for a broad audience. Governance is certainly associated with topics such as corruption and power mishandling, but some of the new themes in the public policy agenda are deeply impacted by how corporations prioritize their decisions in the world today. Think about the fake news phenomenon. To what extent do social media platforms have responsibility for spreading misinformation? If it is true that the medium is the message, as communications theorist Marshall McLuhan recognized more than 50 years ago, big tech should also be held accountable for facilitating the dissemination of fake news. Similarly, when the scandal involving Volkswagen's tape revisions with test results erupted a few years ago, that was a wake-up call for corporate leadership. In our last class, Samar Marziad from Moody's Analytics mentioned ESG as one of the most promising areas and sources of opportunities for differentiation in Brazil. That is one of the reasons why we are here hosting a discussion today about ESG, in particular emphasizing the importance of governance in our seminar. It is therefore with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker today, Vanessa Gomez, Global Associate Director of Sustainable Finance and ESG at Standard & Poor's Global Ratings, where she's involved in various sustainability projects across multiple sectors, including chemicals, services, financial institutions, transportation, healthcare, consumer, infrastructure, and energy. It's a lot of topics to cover for one person. Previously, she worked as a global manager, corporate finance and sustainability at NDEV, and served as an associate vice president and debt capital markets at HSBC, and was a co-founder of a tech startup. So thank you for joining us, Vanessa. A great pleasure once again to have you here. And before we get started, I just want to mention that as part of Brazil Seminar, we have a series of lectures, and this session today is part of a class. And sometimes we have extra sessions. So next week, and if we could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, next week we have an extra session. So students, mark your calendars on March 1st, and it's going to be at noon. So not in our usual time. And it's going to also take place in a different room, room 802. We're going to hear from Edmar Bacha, former president of the Brazilian National Development Bank, one of the godfathers of the Real Plan that ended hyperinflation in Brazil in the 90s, very well-known economist, the author of some of the papers that we have read in our class in previous sessions. It's a unique opportunity for you to get to know someone who has been very influential, not only as an academic, but also as someone who has helped shape policy in Brazil. So next Wednesday at noon, here, we're also going to do live streaming. If you cannot come here to the classroom, but I strongly encourage you to join us in person because, as I said, it's a unique opportunity to interact with someone of that caliber. All right. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand over to Vanessa. And Vanessa, once again, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
And I love the presentation. And Camila and Amber, if we could move to the presenter's slide. She's gonna say next to move the slide, and on my computer, we have access to the presentation as well. So yeah, if you could just move to the. Yeah, we're just waiting for it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again. And yes, we're gonna talk now about cheat, and I will if you can put on the next slide. Oh, sorry. Here we have the main takeaways, like what the things that we'd like to show and discuss in this conversation. And the main takeaways is really how governance connects with the environmental and social factors to drive change. More often than not, we see that we don't see much of the interconnection, that they are completely interconnected. And the other key takeaway that I would like to present here is how well established a corporate governance really underpins this environmental and social performance. And I put a quote here that I think is worth while reading and sharing with you, because it was said by Erica Karp. She's MD and Chief Impact Officer at Pakistan. And I think this contextualizes the conversation we are having here. Quoting, well, if a company is not displaying the principles of good governance, no, we are not interested in investing, because it means they're not taking a holistic view in the long run of all the risks and opportunities. We want companies that are offering a sense of consistency and, again, stewardship, accountability, and incentivization. Companies that are truly looking to innovate in a way that puts them in a position where they are resilient in times of change, where they are driving their own entrepreneurship inside. I think it really highlights what is the importance of governance to environmental and social performance. And as a next slide, please, this is the agenda, so how we navigate through this. So the first step is we just discuss like what is the definition of governance and the connection with the role of the board of directors. Then we want to go through the main environmental social factors. So a brief summary so you can be more familiar and connect to the governance factors and the main policies and how these policies are all connected with environmental and social factors. Then we go to long-term strategy, which is one of the main duties of the board of directors, and discuss a little bit about culture, how that is important, and ESG linked remuneration. And we finish with reporting transparency and governance best practices. Go to next slide, please. So very simply defined, governance is a system of rules, controls, and policies and processes by which a company is directed. And the main force influencing this governance, the corporate governance, is the board of directors. And the basic principles that any corporate governance follows are transparency, accountability, responsibility, fairness, and risk management. It's well known that a well-designed governance structures, it really ensures effective decision making. So sound decisions lead to better performance, more access to capital, and a more sustainable growth. We go to the next slide, please. So because the main influencer, the main influencer of corporate governance is the board of directors, I think it's important to go through what is the role of the board. Like I put here just the main responsibilities. And the first one is the fiduciary duties of loyalty and care. And loyalty means the act of the good of to act for the good of the organization rather than their own benefit. And the care which is exercising reasonable care in all decision making based on adequate information and good faith. The other important responsibility of the board of directors is to define the long-term strategy for the organization. And here we will talk in a couple slides that how that connects with environmental social, how that is important to embed environmental social aspects to a long-term strategy, because environmental social factors are risks and opportunities. Obviously, it varies according to each industry. So obviously there is what we call materiality. So how some factors are more material to some industry than not. Then the other role of the board of directors is establish this policy-based governance system, which we will discuss a little bit further as well, and monitor and control this policy-based governance system. Obviously, risk management, and one of the best practices is having an internal audit that responds directly to the board, so they minimize influences of the executives for managing internal risks, and establish independent committees. So a minimum should be an audit committee that with independent director and a remuneration committee and a director and nomination of the director. So the other very important point, the role of the board is to recruit the CEO, supervise, evaluate, retain, and even fire. And finally, define the executive remuneration. There are more responsibilities here for the board, but I brought these main ones so we can connect those some of those aspects just to environmental and social performance. So I will go to the next slide, please. This slide is basically just a very quick summary of the main environmental and social factors, because it could, that might not be familiar to everyone, but when you go to environmental.
Camilla, next slide, please.
When you go to environmental factors, the main ones are greenhouse gas emissions, waste and pollution, water use, land use, and biodiversity. And when you go to social factors, the most common factors are workforce and diversity, safety management, customer engagement, and communities. I put here a few examples of KPIs for each of those factors, so we can measure, analyze, and compare with peers in the same industry, for example, to understand performance. And I would like to highlight a few ones here, because we will discuss how they are connected to the governance, coming to policy-based governance and culture and strategy. So GHG emissions would normally, beyond having CO2 equivalent intensity, you also have climate policies and different scenarios that you can analyze in a company, either embedded in a strategy, but also defining targets and commitments on reducing emissions. In the social side, I would like to highlight a few aspects of KPIs here is like employee engagement, employee turnover, and gender diversity. A few ones that not everyone is familiar is with customer engagement. We also look at customer satisfaction, retention, cybersecurity, customer data. Something that I've noticed that not everyone is aware of, that those aspects are actually considered in the social aspect of ESG. So I just wanted to briefly present those. I will go to the next slide, please. So now here is the governance structure, how it would look like, and I separated here just to be a little more clear, but the governance works in oversight and structure. There is a code and values, transparency, reporting, and financial operational risks. A lot of the points I highlighted here might be familiar, but it's very important that the board composition disclose the diversity and the committee structures the base committees should be in place, and the chair of those committees should be independent board members, to succession planning and comprehensive board oversight. Obviously, the auditor's independence too. In case of code values, you have the policy framework. That policy framework that needs to be monitored, executed, and aligned with the whole culture of the company as well. Obviously, for those policies to be implemented and really develop the goal of those policies, you need to develop training throughout the organization, throughout all the stakeholders involved in those policies. Also, we look at holding values like the executive remuneration, the incentives. And the reason why I'm here is when you look at holding values, you're really looking at ethics, right? You want the company, the employees to do the right thing. And you need the policies and the awareness of those policies and train so they can do the right thing. Some companies don't have all the basic policies. We're gonna go through this, which is a risk, right? You don't have even a standard or something that you can look up to follow. And an executive remuneration here, which is defined, especially for the CEO, by the board of directors. It's important to generate the right incentives. When you go and cascade those incentives, those targets, it needs to lead to an ethical behavior. So you obviously want the company to generate performance, but you also want to prevent any reputational risk. Finally, transparency reporting also comes here in terms of governance, because obviously, if you have data, if you have transparency, you can monitor, you can manage better. And ESG, nowadays, I think there are a lot of standards of ESG disclosures. They are being integrated now internationally. And there are regulatory frameworks being defined in different countries, which can be very challenging to understand, but they are very advanced. They're coming to becoming much more mature, and those disclosures are becoming more available, which also helps the external parties to understand how the companies operate and any environmental social governance risks. In terms of financial operations and risks, I highlighted here the cybersecurity. And internal controls and audits. From first internal controls and audit, it's valid when they respond directly to the board members, so there is independence there. And cybersecurity is a really growing concern among all industries, mostly because digitization is here, technology, and all industries are really engaging in digitalization technology, and they are increasing CapEx investments in a very substantial way. Also because cybersecurity, which we consider social risk, it could be because of the customer exposure or the data exposure, the operational exposure, that can actually impact cash flow very quickly, like in the very short term. Because if you stop operations, you stop the company, and then there is a much more. Some ESG risks, some environmental social risks can be much more long term. Some of them can be very short term, and one of them is cybersecurity. I would go to the next slide, please. So, one of the important responsibilities of a board of directors is to define the long-term strategy for the company. They may spend a lot of time discussing the long strategy of the company. And normally it takes a strategy for 10 years, and then it can be coupled for 5 to 3 years. But it's important to, when you define these strategies, you really understand the risks and opportunities, the decision making that will lead you to execute that strategy, whether you have a culture that will reinforce and support the execution of that strategy, and whether the executive remuneration, the way the main executives are being incentivized to stay in the long term and help to execute that long-term strategy. So, and what I put here in terms of ESG factors, obviously, is you can embed social and environmental governance factors in all this, right? Because in all this can really support a long-term strategy. Because first of all, like if this is an opportunity, if we're looking at climate change, the weather, depending on the sector you are, or in decision making in acquisitions, how you're looking to acquire companies with ESG risks or not. You might want to understand that, how it looks like on your long-term strategy. And culture, I think we don't discuss enough culture, and I will spend a little bit of time on that, because even if you have a wonderful strategy, you might not be able to execute if you don't have a culture. And culture very linked to the social aspects that I raised a little maybe before, those KPIs that actually can raise red flags, right? When you're looking outside. So those are the important points about long-term strategy. And I will go to the next slide, please. Okay. So just as a very quick overview about the policies. So the main policies here, like is, for example, human rights policy, diversity, inclusion, anti-harassment, code of conduct, cybersecurity, whistleblower, anti-corruption, tax policies, environmental health and safety policy, supply chain, and climate policy. So it's important to have those policies. But also, those policies is important that according to the policy that it's comprehensive in a way that takes into account the value chain, right? It also considers your employees, your contractors, and even in all value chain essentially. This role is and I think I put in the last bullet point is. This is also one link to the culture and risk. Whatever is, if there is a violation of these policies, it's important to the employee, the culture of the company to know that it's not accepted. Because if it is accepted one day, it's accepted another day, it's not gonna be respected with why, and that defines culture to some extent. So and also defines risk. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So I very much appreciate this analogy from Edward Hall of the iceberg compared to culture. So 90% of the iceberg's mass is really lies beneath the surface. So what you can see is only 10%. So when you're outside, a corporate culture is really difficult to see. And what you can see, sometimes you go to the website or the sustainability report or any interaction externally with the company, you see the vision, you see the mission, you see the policies. The companies put the policy, public policies in general on the website, and there's like an external presentation. But what really happens inside is really hard. Like and a lot of the risks, the reputational risks that come from a company, fraud, misconduct, unethical behavior. It sometimes is fostered by that culture, and obviously it was not in the surface. You couldn't see that coming from outside because it looks good, but inside, if you don't respect those policies, if they don't enforce the way that they should practice those policies, that creates like unwritten rules that it's very hard to see the risk. But one thing that I note, I think it's important, like in terms of KPIs, actually, it could be very helpful to understand, and this case shows social, is employee mental health issues, burnout, generates less productivity and higher turnover, lack of motivation, and it's hard to attract new talents because those employees will not recommend other people to join the company, perhaps even say bad things about the company. And unethical behavior could generate external reputational risk that can go beyond the company and really jeopardize P&L, right, for profit and loss, and among others. So this is really hard to value. It's hard to analyze, but if we remember when we talk about strategy, for you to create the right strategy, implement and execute, you need the right culture, because that's what you really will drive your strategy. And obviously for us, it's outside of corporations hard to see, but the more you can understand some KPIs, for example, some social KPIs, for example, high turnover or any controversial ethical or reputational risk that company has, it's a clue, it's a hint. So a health culture really should start from the top, and then from why I'm talking about good cultures, because the governance, the board of directors should start that from top down and influence. So through policies, through monitoring, through control, the integrity, basically doing what you say. So if you say you're gonna do something, just do it. And if you don't say, there is retaliation. And we also implement the right incentives through rewards that could be compensation. And it should be very well thought, because if you just think about financial compensation, which is very important, obviously, to generate profits, but you need to consider that ethical behavior is equally important, because that could, a reputational risk, a fine, you could jeopardize your brand, you could jeopardize a lot of the intangibles of a corporation. And I think the other important point for a health coach should be develop a sense of fairness, process, and transparency. And I will go to the next slide, please. So I think one of I think it's important to look at culture and how that drives change in performance of a corporation, because most of the value that companies nowadays are intangible values. It's really hard to measure, but they're extremely important and very valuable. And human capital, like employees, obviously some industries, human capital are way more important than others, because you're using more intellectual property and so on and so forth. Then those KPIs, when you look at social, like how you have the high incidence of burnout, high incidence of turnover, that will really create a problem for a company if your company is focused on human capital, for example. And if you don't look after some of these ethicals and policies that you've been deploying in your company, you could have a really problem in your reputation and brand, which can customers can stop consuming your product. So it's those social values in many ways, and even environmental values and performance, it really influences the performance in many aspects of a corporation. And one of them, a lot of them, just so you go directly to the right incentives for
Camila, next slide, please.
Another incentive for environmental and social performance.
Next slide.
Thank you. Another important incentive, that's a very growing incentive, that also comes from top down, comes from the board of directors, comes from a good governance, is ESG linked regular remuneration. There is some data here from the conference board that says that 73% of S&P 500 companies are now using some type of KPIs linked to the executive remuneration. A lot of that is D&I, like is diversity, equity, inclusion, and obviously a big part of that is related to carbon footprint and emissions reductions. And this is growing. I think that this is becoming something that is being well discussed in the boardroom and among in the governance, being implemented towards those goals to actually be executed. I would go to no, 1 second. So in terms of ESG linked remuneration, I'd like to raise here, and we mentioned a goal is a challenge of transparency reporting in clear regulatory framework. I think everyone's facing this. We, from several stakeholders, some investors, ratings agencies, all need data clear data to compare that comparable with different companies in different countries, so they can assess a much larger number of companies. And it's very confusing right now. There are a lot of different reporting systems, but they are being integrated. And as I mentioned, like, there is clear regulatory framework happening. The speed varies according to countries. So that's a global initiative there's a global initiative for international sustainability standards boards. And I will go for the next slide, please. So there are some initiatives that I just picked a few ones that are being implemented. So corporate sustainability reporting in the European Union, U.S. Securities Exchange Commission. They are this is become a regulatory framework for companies that file in the United States. But this is much more focused on disclosure of climate-related risks. So and the International Sustainability Standards Board, this is the one that could facilitate the disclosure and transparency of data, because they are working together with GRI, with other famous sustainability standards like SASB and TTFD to aggregate a common standard that everyone can use, and it helps everyone to compare those performance KPIs for environmental social. So the reason I mentioned standards and regulations and transparency is to remember governance looks at that too, right? One of the responsibilities of governance is the transparency and reporting of those data and audits reporting. So this is a trend that is it's happening. A lot of these sustainability reports and specific data being audited as well, external pilot audits. So this is an initial trend. I also put here some best practices for you to, if you have curiosity and deep dive a little bit. There are some global best practices on governance. So, for example, here the global governance principles for international ICGN. And they recommend that at least 1/3 of the board position should be held by women. Most of the directors should have relevant knowledge, independence, and competence in the industry and diversity perspectives. The role of the chair of the board should separate from the CEO, and ideally, majority of the board members should be independent. And also establish those independent committees. The independent committees of auditing and executive remuneration and director nomination, they're the base. So I would recommend these two documents that are very much summarize some of the global best practices on governance. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you. Vanessa, I think that's a great way to kick off the discussion. And just want to recap a little bit what we talked about in the last couple of classes here. There were more foundational topics for social study. We talked about democracy, we talked about the macroeconomic situation in Brazil, and today we are delving deeper into a specific topic more related to ESG. So for this audience, this is a course that has been offered at the School of National Public Affairs. So this audience is particularly interested in the impact of policies in the real world society. To what extent, and I think you mentioned here, but to what extent policy is shaped by what happens in the market and vice versa?
Policy is extremely important, public policy. But in fact, a lot of the initiatives being taken by private companies, banks, etc. It's because we yet to have a very clear public policies in climate and in regulatory framework, rules very well clearly defined. I think I would say that if you have if you define a lot of this in a very clear regulatory framework, with deadlines, the transformation change will be much quicker. But so that's the importance of policymaking and defining regulations, because it's way more powerful than any private initiative. A lot of this you've seen, it's mostly private initiatives. Once there is a more cohesive policymaking regulatory framework globally, I would say, but even regionally, like the European Union has been doing a lot in this aspect, that will drive a remarkable and meaningful change.
Very good. And this class is also part of the context where we use Brazil as a case study, and we tend to bring global teams in a discussion that connects to Brazil. I know that you don't specifically focus on Brazil, but as a Brazilian and as somebody who works when in a business that where Brazil is very relevant, and what are the things that you can say about what's being done in the right way and the wrong way in the country?
I think Brazil, so it's important disclaimer. I'm not focused on Brazil anymore, but it's important to say that actually Latin America is developing a lot of the standards for sustainability, and in several spheres, like central bank spheres, they're really engaging stress testing, understanding what the climate risk goes for a financial system. The disclosure of the companies are also being, I would say, reinforced. The last few years, they have had major changes and additions to basic reporting from the corporations to the main regulator in Brazil. And there is a very interesting evolving initiatives on the cargo markets in Brazil. So in Latin America, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the largest cargo markets in the world. And it's growing, and they organize themselves. They're creating voluntary markets to benefit themselves from this possibility of carbon offsets.
We know that Europe has to be ahead of the game, everything related to ESG. So when you think about, and you mentioned Latin America, there have been some good examples. What are the areas where the gap has to be bridged?
I think what comes to my mind quickly is regulation. It is, there are a lot of forces against deploying regulations for disclosure of environmental, social aspects and managing risks. There are a lot of pressure against. So I think to close those gaps would be education. Understanding of the impact of those risks and how that it is important. So that's why I highlighted some of the social factors here. I think sometimes people don't understand how they can affect the bottom line. For example, like if you are very focused human capital corporation, if you have a really high turnover and hard to attract talent, guess what? It might be really difficult for you to provide the services. And that impacts, profit and loss. What is very interesting now, and this gap is being closed, the biggest, largest investors, the pension funds, the large amounts of money being invested, and they are really being engaged with corporations, with other funds to drive change. So I think that's doesn't happen like in a day. So those gaps will be closed. I'm very optimistic about it. I think in ESG, environmental, social governance, risks and opportunities are being seen and supported by investors, very large amount of money that will drive a lot of change. It might take some time, but it will drive change.
And more specifically related to market opportunities, right? For corporations focusing on ESG, what are the advantage and the challenge that creates for companies that generally internalize that as part of their modus operandi?
So one of the advantages to internalize that is brand. Like it's brand, like, it can be very, it can create very strong brands, and we all know that strong brands, it has business in many ways, and the relationship with customers, it can enhance that relationship. So your top line, your revenues can increase if you have a very strong brand with a high reputation and connection with your customers. That was one of example. And also this is an opportunity, right? Could be a risk. So if you are not looking at your internal policies and monitoring them and managing those risks, if there is an unethical behavior that goes to market, that can generate a lot of loss because you by fees, by legal lawsuits and reputation, and they can really destroy value in many parts of your valuation. It could be destroyed in revenues. It could, in terms of costs, you have to pay a lot of costs and fees for that, and maybe your license to operate, it could lose. It could actually go out of business. So if you don't actually manage those risks, it can be very costly to your company. But also you can enhance, you take advantage of some of this social environmental aspects to be part of this trend. We're in a very big trend. Like, the interesting thing is the investors are really aware, but the consumers are becoming way more aware. I think all of us are way more aware about our consumption, our decisions than 10, 15 years ago, right? And if when you go to the supermarket to buy some products, you want to buy the cleanest product possible, because you're more aware, just because you're more aware. And if the companies don't follow that trend, they will just lose market share.
Yeah, I think it's everybody, it's pretty straightforward, the connection between the opportunities and adopting ESG. At the same time, there's still some skepticism, especially I would say among more traditional investors, even more Buffett, for instance. He has expressed his opinion about it, saying that profitability should come first. So do you think that there's this dichotomy between the priorities?
I think so. Everything I mentioned here was thinking about profitability, right? I think that's why a lot of these standards we consider very much in Europe for each corporation, each industry. So that's can generate opportunities, but also big risks. Obviously, if you're not a profitable company, you will be out of operations very soon. So you definitely need to be profitable. Now, your ways of doing business, if it is obviously feasible, ideally you would make that feasible, and it's increasingly being more feasible, I think, to adapt and add some of these risks and opportunities, like monitoring risks and adding opportunities. To including CapEx in some new technologies and new products, etc. That can also enhance your profit and loss. So it's always a balance. When you're looking at valuation and cash flow, you need to look about that, and you can make some assumptions and create a budget for that, right? So it is possible to be profitable and environmental and social science sound, right? And in fact, that could even lead to a much more sound company. But yes, to be profitable is extremely important, otherwise you will be out of business.
So you mentioned capital markets, and when you think about Brazil, it's inevitable to associate Brazil with the Amazon these days. Based on your professional experience, have you seen initiatives related to ESG with an impact on the Amazon?
Well, I think what's being mostly discussed, I think, is carbon markets. It's the way you can prevent deforestation by protecting some areas and having companies to reassure and analyze that, we can say about sell carbon credits, the certificates for that. That is a possibility. It's very challenging because there is a lot of strong forces going there, and there's a lot of work to do. So I obviously I'm more like everyone and hope that a lot of options, there are alternatives to generate profits other than deforestation happen and are created, and hoping that would happen. But nowadays it's very scattered, for me it's unclear whether that would be profitable enough to prevent deforestation.
Yeah, and to conclude this first part of the class, can you think of some anecdotal evidence of how ESG has created positive impact, and at the same time has contributed to enhance the company's competitive strategy in Brazil or elsewhere? Yeah, to what extent ESG has contributed to help a corporation on their competitive strategy, and some examples, both either in Brazil or elsewhere.
Well, really,
Or maybe something that you can disclose, because I imagine that a lot of your work tends to be confidential, or
yeah, it's confidential. It's also hard for me to say specifically because I'm not looking at financials anymore. Like I'm looking more at these KPIs. So that generated competitive strategy that increase market share. That's I'm an economist, so that would be more like the previous job that I would look at doing this much more in details. But what I can assume is some companies, a lot of companies were created, for example, startups with very eco-friendly products, eco-friendly package, lower chemicals, natural ingredients, and they very quickly grew their market share and became very prominent brands that some of you might know. I started consuming some of them, and what happens is big large corporations buy those companies to add to their portfolios and increase the competitive advantage. Sometimes they develop those products themselves, but more often than not, they actually acquire other companies. And sometimes you don't even know, but a larger conglomerate acquired that company and that brand. So that gives them a competitive advantage and access to a niche of consumers that they probably not attending before. They're probably not on their customer mind.
Yeah, if I can recall correctly, probably one of the most successful examples in Brazil that a company that actually was created with the ESG DNA even before the term existed was Natura. And even Natura was acquired, if I'm not mistaken, Avon, like 3 years back, or a larger cosmetic company. So I think in Brazil, in particular, we see some good examples of best practices, right? And hopefully some of those companies, those models can be replicated in other parts of the economy. So with that, we conclude the first part of our discussion here, and we're going to continue with Vanessa on a closed session so that students will have the opportunity to interact more with our speaker. And we are coming back next week with Edmar Basha. It's going to be an extra session. We're going to be also live streaming the event on March 1st at 12 noon Eastern time.